And for the last game of Month of Edge, we have Manhunt 2, the sequel to the alleged murder simulator that was the first game. This game is often aired as the most violent video game of all time, even being rated adults only at one point. Hillary Clinton herself went against Manhunt 2 to make sure people don't play this game, as apparently it's even more violent than the first one, so surely it must be the better game, right? Well, let's take a look. I will be looking at the PS2 version as well. It's important to note which version you are playing.
Open gate 13.
So Manhunt 2 has nothing to do with the first game at all, like legit nothing. You play as Danny Lamb, a research patient in a psychiatric ward. Right off the bat, you see Danny clearly suffers from some kind of trauma or psychological issue. Probably both. He also has amnesia and is in a mental asylum of sorts. Well, a thunderstrike causes the asylum's power to go out and the cell doors open. Danny kills the nurse and then gets the hell out of there. He teams up with his friend Leo, who guides Danny on out of the asylum. The rest of the game is about Danny trying to figure out what the hell is wrong with him and what happened in his previous life. There's also this organization known as the Project that seems to be after him and Leo. The Project are very mysterious throughout the game, and not much is known about them until the end of the game. Leo also seems hell-bent on destroying the Project. The game keeps you shrouded in mystery really until like the final level, giving you some little drips of information here and there like about Danny's past, but most of the game is a mystery. The plot of Manhunt 2 I find really questionable. While I find the plot initially quite intriguing and mysterious, I will say I quickly lost this feeling, and by the end of the game I was just kind of disappointed with it all. I think the plot of the first game is far superior to this game. The setup in the first game was much more original, darker, and just sinister. You didn't play as a good guy, you didn't kill innocent people, you killed other scumbags for a sick piece of crap. Manhunt 2 really takes a different direction, and I don't like it anywhere near as much. I will say Danny, to start off with, is portrayed as a much more sympathetic character, and I honestly just don't like this one bit. This guy is messed up in the head, and so is Leo, but Leo doesn't try to act good and isn't portrayed in a sympathetic way at all. He doesn't feel remorse. Danny does. He throws up when he sees the gore. He feels bad about what he sees and does. I don't really like Danny as a whole in the game. He isn't the most likable protagonist, and that clearly wasn't what the developers were going for. He just kind of stumbles around the whole game going, who am I? They give you no reason to even root for this guy. At least in the first game you knew you were scum, and you just wanted to see how far this would go. Danny, though, no, not at all. He speaks way more than the first character than Cash ever did, and is way less likable than Cash. In fact, Leo does everything for him a majority of the game. I'd say Leo is a stronger character even. Also, Danny's backstory, really not impressed with that one, and I thought it was underdeveloped even. I thought the Project was just disappointing all around. They start out all mysterious and evil-like, but I will just say that by the end of the game, they're borderline devalued, and I just wasn't interested by the end of it. The end of the game is also incredibly weird, and not at all what I would expect. Was the ending good? Not really. The ending was just disappointing, really, and I just think that kind of spells out across the entire plot of the game. It's just disappointing. It has a strong start, but it really goes out on a whimper. In addition to the actual plot just being nowhere near as good as the first ones, the atmosphere and just kind of setting are just nowhere near as good as the first Manhunts. They're just shot. I think the first Manhunt had one of the best settings in any PS2 game and was a great horror setting as well. This game, no, not at all, and you'd be hard-pressed to even count this as a horror game. The setting is rather boring, the city is lame, the atmosphere is just not here. It pales in comparison to the first one. Even not comparing the plot, setting, or atmosphere to the first Manhunt, I still don't think it's very good. I just think it's rather weak and borderline underdeveloped in many aspects, with a rather lackluster conclusion. If I wanted to go into spoiler territory, I'd be here another 5 minutes explaining why I don't like it, but I try not to spoil the games in these reviews, so I'm just going to stop and say I'm not a fan of it. Now, when it comes to the gameplay of Manhunt 2, it isn't totally different from the first game. For a majority of the game, you play as Danny, but there are some levels where you play as Leo. They both control and play exactly the same, though. The game is primarily a stealth game with some horror elements and a bunch of third-person shooting. I will say one thing that threw me off immediately is the controls are pretty different from Manhunt 1. Don't you just love it when, like, sequels change up the controls for no good reason? At least the controls make more sense than they did in the original Manhunt. So what can Danny do? Well, he's pretty much the same as Cash. He can walk, run, take cover, and even do some contextual actions. He can actually mantle up stuff, climb, crawl, etc. You can still hit walls to summon enemies, and you can hide in the shadows to be hidden. Instead of an icon, it's now just whether or not the bar is black or not. If it's black, you're hidden. If it's white, you're in the open. And if it's red, you're spotted. You don't regenerate health, and you still need to find painkillers as well. The stamina meter from the first game is gone, but you can still run out of stamina. You just won't know now. Then, of course, we get to the weapons. The main thing you'll be doing in Manhunt 2 is what's in the name. Hunting man. There's plenty of weapons in this game. Actually, more weapons in this game than the first one. Of course, there's the distraction items like the cans, bottles they use to distract enemies. There's small weapons like your favorite, the plastic bag or glass shard. They have a one-time use and are silent. The medium-sized weapons like hedge clippers, crowbar. Then there's those big weapons like the shovels, baseball bats. All those weapons make noise when you kill someone with them, but they have infinite uses, unlike those small little ones. And then, of course, you have the firearms. Pistols, submachine guns, shotguns, assault rifles here. And the same weird lock-on system that was in the first Manhunt is in this one. It's generally clunky and it's as unresponsive as the first game's was. You can also free aim, but this is even worse. So majority of the gameplay has you hiding in the shadows and then getting behind people undetected and killing them in a very gruesome fashion. Once you get behind someone, you are locked onto them and your character gets into the right animation, you can execute him. Once you are in the animation, of course, the longer you hold the square button, or whatever button it is for you, the more gruesome the execution. There's 3 levels still. These are just as gruesome. In fact, they are way more gruesome than the first games. A few of them return from the first Manhunt, but most of them are new and are definitely more gory. They have now added weapon executions, as in like firearm executions. If you get behind somebody with a firearm, you just straight up execute them with that. There's even environmental executions where you get behind somebody, press square when you're just on the right spot in the map, and you'll perform just an awful execution. You'll see on the mini-map there's a skull marker for these. The mini-map works the same, where there's 3 levels of detection, and enemies show up on the mini-map when they make noise. That is when you're being stealthy. There have been some new additions to the stealth, I will say. For instance, now while enemies still don't go into darkness unless they see you run into it, they will look into the darkness, and if this happens you get a quick time event or else you get caught. Sometimes walking on certain terrain makes more noise, like gravel. You can also destroy lights to make more darkness. That's all when you're being stealthy though, as there are plenty of times when you're not stealthy in Manhunt 2. The hand-to-hand combat returns, and it's definitely better. It's not as stiff or clunky, but it's still not very good. You can do light attacks and heavy attacks, block, or just run away. But it's generally not a good or smart idea to take them on with melee combat. When you have like a weapon, it's a lot easier, but really it's just a lot easier to kill them stealthily. Then there are the firefights, which are pretty generic third-person shooter firefights. This was after Gears of War, so the whole taking cover and popping out to shoot enemies is in full effect here. The shooting is definitely better than the first games, but there is a lot more of it, that's for sure. It feels better and plays a little better, but it still feels rather loose. It's quite basic though, and it's nowhere near as much fun as the stealth portions. When you aren't just killing enemies, you're usually trying to go to the next area to kill more enemies. The levels are all incredibly linear and have a set path. Occasionally you have to like press a button, flip a switch, something like that, but usually it's just to get on to go kill more people. There is less missions than the first games, but most of them go on decently different from the last. At least they're all different is what I'm saying. You go to some weird places in this game though. A sex shop, a dungeon, a red light district. I'm sensing a theme here. Well, it isn't the scummy areas of the first game, but it's still pretty scummy. But for the most part, the gameplay of Manhunt 2 is largely the same as the originals. There are quite a number of little additions to the gameplay that I mentioned from the first, but if you played the first, you'll feel more than right at home here, as most of the game still revolves around you doing the same thing. It's just getting behind people and doing these gruesome, awful executions.
It's too late.
So now I think it's time to discuss the graphics of Manhunt 2, and this is where the game falters quite a bit. I don't actually think the graphics are very good. They aren't bad, but they don't stand out or do anything that well. Well, it's already weird enough that the game came out in 07 on the PS2. The PS3 had been out a year already. I think the graphics for a PS2 game aren't even all that impressive. I think it looks decent, but nothing above that. Of course, it was also on the Wii, and as a Wii game, I think the game looks just fine. Let me explain. The character models are all decent to good. They all have a decent amount of detail and have some facial expressions. And the animation, while a bit stiff, is still decent enough, and during the executions, it's great. I mean, that much is obvious. There's no lip syncing, though, which is really weird for a game that came out in 2007. But the models aren't awful. They just look a tad outdated, even when they came out. The environments all look perfect for what they are, though. They're dark, depressing, shitty looking, gritty, all that. That's great. And going forward, I think it's just worth bringing up that they at least kept that intact from the first game. Everything looks rather dark and shitty. And these textures, saying they're not very good would be probably missing the point. So I'm going to just say that's how they should be. The lighting is nowhere near as good as the first games, though, I will say that. Now, my biggest issue with the graphics is easily the effects and the frame rate. Now, the first Manhunt had some really cool kind of lo-fi VHS tape effects. There was quite a number of them in the game, and I thought they actually really added to the feeling of the game and were definitely a positive. For Manhunt 2, they decided to take that and just completely ruin it by going insane with it. The effects in this game are just ridiculous. They are all over the place. There's way too much of it. Like, when you kill someone, you're going to have a freaking seizure seeing this if you're not careful. The effects are just out of control in this game. And I know that some of them were put there probably just to censor the game in some capacity, but it's just way too much. And you can't even turn it off. The only one you can turn off is the shitty, like, filter lines. I actually had to stop playing the game at one point because I was just getting a headache from all these effects. There's also a lot of head bob and screen shaking present in this game when you're running. It's like, holy shit, how much shit is going on? The frame rate in this game just sucks for the most part. Like, any moment that all these effects come on, like, the game just dies on the frame rate. When a lot of gunfire happens or an explosion happens, like, the same thing. The frame rate just dies. In fact, it goes down to single digits. For a majority of the game, I'd say it does stay at a constant 30, but like, once those effects or the gunfights show up and become more common towards the end of the game, just expect to see the frame rate just tank in many situations. I just thought it was really poor. I never had any issues with the first one, like, at all, but this game, when it comes to graphics, they were just more of a pain in the ass than anything else. I know the PC version has options and mods to get rid of all these effects, screen shaking, and better frame rate to boot, but here I am with the PS2 version, and that's why I feel that the graphics are, as a whole, just not very good. They're not terrible, but they're not very good. I don't think the sound fares much better, really. Maybe a little better. The music is sadly just completely forgettable. It's generic. There's nothing to even comment on here. I couldn't think of a single track. It doesn't even really set the mood. It didn't do anything. The first game set the mood perfectly with the music. This game just does nothing. It's very poor. I don't have anything to describe the music. It's completely forgettable. It does not set the mood very well. It's just crap. It's not good. Luckily, the sound effects are still wonderful. Killing people is just as gruesome as it ever should be. It's borderline disturbing, actually, and sounds really meaty. The voice acting, I'm gonna be honest, is kind of a mixed bag. It's not all great here. I thought the first game was great. This game, though, not so much. Everyone sounds like they try. It's just some of the characters just don't have the best voice acting. Like, it sounds kind of off. Some of it sounds stilted. Some of it doesn't. It's just kind of inconsistent. It's kind of hard to explain. I just didn't think the voice acting was phenomenal or even all that great. I'd say that there might actually be too much voice acting. I gotta say, the crazy people, though, they still sounded crazy. There's just way, way less of them in this game. It wasn't bad, but meh overall. Speaking of meh to bad, I think it's time we go over some of the key issues with this game. I already brought up all my issues with the graphics, the blur, the frame rate, the shaking, but I will say that it does have an effect on the controls and can make them feel clunky. While the first game had quite the number of clunky moments and sometimes sluggish control, this game, for the most part, fixes that. However, when all this other crap is going on, like I said, the controls become less responsive. It led to moments where my character would do something that I didn't want him to do. I'd get spotted because of that or something along those lines. I would say, honestly, the controls, they're on the same level as the first one, and they can take some time to get used to. Executions are still finicky, as you still need to be in that kill animation, otherwise you just swing the weapon. I would say it's gotten less finicky, but I think the actual answer is that I've gotten better. While the combat in terms of hand-to-hand has gotten better, it still sucks. You just trade blows with the enemy and it doesn't feel very good. You still get kind of punished for getting spotted by putting up with this not very good combat. Speaking of getting spotted, the AI in this game is just nowhere near as good as it was in the previous game. And while they do have a few tricks up their sleeve, like they got some new tactics, they overall are just way stupider and often don't pursue you for more than a few seconds. In the first game, they were just relentless and were like as fast as the player. Here, that is not the case at all. They are nowhere near as fast and they rarely pursue you. They just really don't. But it doesn't stop there. The shooting, like I said, it's just not good. While it is better, that's for sure, it still is nowhere near as good as a normal third-person shooter from this era. It feels really loose, it doesn't feel all that great, it's not exactly the most satisfying, and all around it just feels kinda half-assed. It looks awkward and is awkward to an extent. I mean, the original Manhunt kinda got a little leeway since games like Resident Evil 4 and Gears of War weren't out yet, but this is not the case for Manhunt 2. The only part of the shooting I actually like is when you blow someone's brains out. It's just ridiculously gory. Other than that, I think the shooting is, again, pretty subpar, and while, again, it might be better than the originals, it's still not good. But I will say there is a lot more shooting in this game. I'd say probably half of the missions, maybe more, have tons of shooting in them. Like, why is there so much shooting? I'd much prefer more stealth missions, but no, that's not the case. Instead, it's just more mindless shooting. Due to this, I think a majority of the levels in Manhunt 2 are just not that great. In fact, I would say for a majority of the levels, I wasn't really having fun. While not all the levels are bad, it's just most of them were not my cup of tea, and that is mostly due to how prevalent the shooting is in these levels. Some of them aren't the best designed to begin with, but when they throw you like into a level and you just mow down a bunch of dudes, a couple dozen dudes, I just really was not a fan of this. I think the weakest aspect of the game is the shooting, so they decided to emphasize half of the game on shooting. Therefore, if my math checks out, half of the game isn't very good. The levels where you have to be stealthy and there are no guns, I think are good, to even great in a few cases, but these levels really are only like at the beginning of the game. After that, guns take front and center. And of course, you could not use these guns. You could still use melee and be stealthy and all that, but what's the point? It's just going to take forever and it's easy to die. It's even more of a shame because there's so many executions and so many unique ways that you can kill people, and I'm sure that a bunch of people who play this game aren't going to see some of these awesome executions because you use guns, because some of these executions are awesome. Any horror aspects of the first game, or any horror aspects in general, are just not in this game. Like, I'm just gonna leave it at that. There's nothing. In addition to that, this game is way shorter than the first. It took me maybe 6, at the most 7 hours to beat it. First game took me well over 10 or 11 hours to finish. So yeah, it has a shorter, less fulfilling story mode. And I think I just gave away how I feel about the game as a whole. I don't really like it. I think due to the shooting alone and how frequent it is, it drags the game down quite a bit. On top of the graphical issues and my disapproval of the story, I don't actually think Manhunt 2 is a very good game. It does have some good to it, it's not all bad, but looking at the whole game, there's definitely more bad than good here. There are some glimpses of hope, I will say, levels where you go around in the shadows doing these gory as hell executions, but then for every glimpse of hope, there's like 2 or 3 bad shooting sections to ruin it. I honestly would have to say that the best thing that the game is going for it are these executions. That's what got the game in hot water to begin with, and that's the best part of the game. Everything else, like literally almost everything else in the game that doesn't center around the executions, is just underwhelming to bad. Now, before I give my final thoughts, I will say the version you play of Manhunt 2 is important. The PS2, the PSP, and the Wii version is the most censored and are probably the worst versions. The PC version is uncensored and you can make it fully uncensored if you mod it, and has the best graphics overall, and I recommend that one if you can get a copy. For some reason it's not on any digital storefronts, I have no idea why. The Wii and PC version have way more QuickTime events, like even for just executions. I'm glad that's not here in the PS2 version. The PC version also has the rating system from the first game. I have no idea why that's not here. The PS2 version, it just doesn't have it. There are even more differences between these versions, but those are just some of the biggest ones. There's a whole wiki page just about the differences between these versions. Really strange. But in the end, I don't think it matters too much. That's because I don't recommend the game. While I wholeheartedly recommended the first game to really anyone who could stomach the violence, this game, not so much. I'd say you should watch the executions, get grossed out, and probably leave it at that. The actual game isn't that great. or even good. It's very middling at its very best, and I think it's just generally bad. But as always, if you guys disagree with me or think the game is great, tell me why in the comments below. Make sure to sub, comment, like, dislike, share, add to playlist, whatever it is you guys are going to do. I much appreciate it as long as you interact. So thank you very much. This has been the end of Month of Edge 3. Sorry that it conclude on not the best game, but at least it was the goriest game for sure. It might be the goriest game ever made. Regardless, have a wonderful Christmas.